This is the one that I've been waiting to talk about for such a long time, the Precision Rifle Shoot at the Rocky Mountain Airgun Challenge 2022. We're not going to just scrape the surface on this one, we're going to jump right in the deep end. For the first time ever, I actually decided to film the entire course of fire, and my wonderful wife Nicole was with me to focus on getting the footage on camera while I focused on my shooting this time. And I needed to focus on my shooting because for the first time I really felt quite a lot of pressure to actually do well in this discipline. I'm in a pretty weird position actually when it comes to precision rifle, because there are no competitions anywhere near where I live, so I never get the opportunity to actually compete against other people and sort of weigh up where I stand in the bigger picture of things and how good I am. I've only ever competed in two competitions, believe it or not, the 2018 Rocky Mountain Airgun Challenge and the 2019 Rocky Mountain Airgun Challenge, and I actually won the precision rifle both those years. The thing is, a lot of things have changed since then. That was sort of the amateur era of precision rifle airgun shooting. Since then, the NRL 22 has introduced an airgun class which allows guys like Justin Welch and Dylan Whittier to compete regularly, basically on a monthly basis, and get better and better all the time. And then also with all the big cash prizes, you've got really well-known PRS shooters from the firearms world coming over and taking part. Guys like David Preston and Aaron Hipp, who obviously have a ton of experience. All the while, I'm sort of stuck in purgatory with no competitions that I can compete in and kind of experience that pressure and learn from people and go through the same course of fire and shoot at the same targets. I'm basically here gathering cobwebs while other guys are moving up and getting that experience. In theory, I wouldn't stand a chance, except I have a bit of a secret weapon. In the past at RMAC, for the precision rifle discipline, it was pellets only, but this year they've opened the door to slugs. And that means I can use what I believe is probably the best gun at the competition. And what I mean by that is ballistic performance. I'm shooting a 40 grain Javelin Gen 2 at 1,040 feet per second with a BC of around 0.14, maybe even slightly higher. And impact. I don't think there's any other guns this year that actually can compete with that in terms of bucking impact. The wind. And it's not just going toe to toe with some of the top match rimfires in terms of ballistic performance, but in terms of precision as well. I'm putting 10 shots in like 0.6, 0.7 MOA at 100 yards. I'm consistently shooting bench rest scores of like 235 to 240 and above in the wind with that gun. It's just ridiculously accurate. So that begs the question, can I, with significantly less experience, make up the points difference purely by having superior ballistic performance? I know I'm going to lose some points with lack of experience and not quite knowing what I'm doing at these competitions to some of the other guys, but can I make it up by actually hitting stuff that they wouldn't be able to hit in the strong wind? Well, on a calm day, the extra ballistic performance wouldn't matter, but my prayers had been answered. It was not a calm day. It was going to be extremely, extremely rough, and that put a big grin on my face.
Super exciting day. We've got the Precision Marksman's Challenge. We've got some really cool courses of fire today. You've got fire trucks, you've got tanks, you've got old saloons, you've got ATVs, you've got all kinds of things to shoot from today.
If you haven't noticed already, this is going to be a little bit different to many other PRS courses that you find. Now, this is an armored personnel carrier by the looks of things. We've got a massive fire truck down that side, and we're going to be shooting off and out of these things. So it's going to be a lot of movement and a lot of trying to build a position and climbing up stuff and all of that, but that's kind of what I enjoy the most. So I think out of all the events, this is going to be my favorite. As to whether I'll do well or not, I have no idea. I don't really know where I stand, but let's give it our best and see what happens. I was in squad 8, which means I would start on stage 8, but I was actually the first shooter in my squad, which means I was taking the very first shots. And I had a pretty cool squad actually. I had Tom from Armageddon Gear in my squad. I had Boyd Linder, who was also quite an experienced PRS shooter, Dusty Powers, who would be the eventual bench rest champion, so pretty much a star-studded squad, if you could call it that. And that was a good thing in one sense, because you learn from the people around you and you can kind of watch what they do, but also probably adding a little bit of pressure, because you naturally compare yourself to the guys around you, and if they are shooting better than you stage after stage, it can make you feel like you are just bombing out and an inferior shooter. So there's positive and negatives to that.
Here comes the wind.
So here we go with stage 8. KYL with targets ranging from 1 inch down to 1/4 inch and at 35 yards. So if you do your maths, that's smaller than 1 MOA on that smallest target. And a 6-inch plate at 90 yards, which had to be engaged between each hit on the KYL. So 10 shots in total if you hit everything first time. If the KYL is cleared, the last 3 shots can be fired at the 90-yard target. My strategy here was to dial 0.1 mil down, so I'm zeroed for the 35-yard KYL, set my parallax for the 35-yard KYL, and hold 1.4 mils using the reticle for the 90-yard target. Even though the 90-yard target was a little bit blurry, it didn't matter because I knew it was big enough that I'd hit it every time. My focus was fully on the smaller KYLs. Those were the ones that would be a challenge. I was pretty zoomed in so I could spot my impacts on the larger KYL and kind of hold for wind accordingly when I got to the smaller ones. The wind started howling just as I had to engage the smallest KYL, so I tried to wait it out, but it didn't let up, so I had to just go for it, and that 40 grain slug flew dead straight, cutting through the wind like butter. I just barely nicked it, but it was enough to clear the stage and gave me the best possible start with a full score. I had made a couple last minute changes to my gun, and I actually have a few people to thank for some of these changes. Remember, I didn't bring my own gun with me from home. I had to put this gun together before the competition. I borrowed a 700cc 300 ml bottle from Ken Hicks just to move my center of balance a bit forward and get my balance point right, so thank you, Ken, for that. Utah Air Guns gave me a Armageddon Game Changer sandbag to use, so thanks Utah Air Guns, really appreciate that. Chris Turek from Up North Air Gunner had given me a Coltac cheat sheet, which is basically a way to mount a data sheet for each stage where it's visible. So if you pause here, you'll see my notes for this stage. And lastly, Thane Simmons from Sabre Tactical had given me a prototype part to try, a magnet that mounts behind the cocking lever and essentially holds it back, so you don't have to worry about it moving forward by itself and double loading as you move between positions. Even with the 700cc bottle though, I only got like 15 shots per fill at that power level, so I had to refill between each stage. Not a bad thing really, because for these PRS competitions you only really need like 10 shots per stage, so it wasn't a downside, but it just goes to show how powerful the setup actually is. Stage 9 was pretty straightforward. We'd be shooting off a barrel and engaging a number of targets from 25 to 100 yards. Some guys, like Boyd here, opted to shoot off a bipod and sandbag. I felt a little more comfortable shooting off a single bag and sort of putting my left hand beneath the rear of the gun as a rear support, but there wasn't really a right or wrong way to do it. It was just personal preference. Nicole was a little bit late to hit record on this one, but you get the idea. I felt pretty comfortable on the barrel actually, and I was pretty happy with my drop and hold data, but this is where things started to go wrong. I'm a little too zoomed in here and I just don't have a good peripheral awareness. I dial for the 100-yard target, take aim, and damn it, I just shot the 55-yard target. That's 10 points gone. And this is where the pressure starts to get to me. I miss the 100-yard target, and then I go back to the 55 yard like I'm supposed to, but I forget to dial back to 55 yards. So I shoot over the top of it. Eventually I make the correction and hit it like I should have the first time, and then come back to the 25-yard target for the last 2 shots. Nothing can frustrate you as much as watching that little piece of steel swaying around like a pendulum and knowing that the clock is ticking down as the darn thing just doesn't want to stop moving. 23 seconds elapse while I wait for the thing to stop, and with time almost up, I have no choice but to just shoot. And I miss. That there was my first sort of nightmare stage, and I think it did get to me mentally. All my confidence just went straight out the window. The next stage was actually one I was looking forward to because it wasn't a complicated stage with different distances to account for and lots of dialing and parallax. It was all about positional shooting off uncomfortable positions, and that's something that I think I'm pretty good at. Once again though, that stupid swaying target that just doesn't want to stop moving, and having very little experience gauging how much time I have per shot during a stage, I wasn't sure whether to wait it out and risk running out of time or to just kind of go for it and complete the course of fire. When I did miss here, I wasn't sure where I'd missed and by how much. And in hindsight, I should have just trusted my data and kept the same hold, but I looked at the way that the dust was blowing and used a different hold and missed again. I've nothing really more to say about this stage other than to say it was incredibly frustrating to feel very stable, to have a laser beam of a gun, and to just not know where I was missing. Once again, just one of those things that you want to put behind you and move on as quickly as possible.
Tom? 30 seconds. Impact. Impact. 25 seconds.
We then cycled back to stage 6, and this one was all about moving between prone, sitting, kneeling and standing positions, which is something I also consider one of my strengths. I did 3-position 10-meter shooting when I was growing up, so I have a little bit of experience with that, and I thought I could get on top of it. But I think I was still a little bit mentally thrown off by the previous stage, just wondering what on earth the wind was doing, and I wasn't quite sure where to hold for the first couple shots at 85 yards. The wind was quite severe at this point, and I think a lot of shooters scored really low on the stage, but again, I feel like my inability to control the pressure of being under a time constraint really let me down, as I just wasn't thinking as clearly as I should have. This was by far my worst stage. I'm not even going to talk about the rest of it. It was a mess. Being able to remain calm and steady under pressure is definitely a skill that some of the more experienced guys like Boyd had, and I didn't. At this point, I actually turned to Nicole and I said, okay, Nicole, clearly I'm not as prepared as I thought I'd be. I don't stand a chance, so I'm going to stop counting scores. I'm just going to have fun. And honestly, this was probably the best mindset I could have adopted, because from here on out, things started getting better and better as I was able to just let go and have fun. Some context here, I did actually do a fair amount of sort of mental preparation before the event. I'd made cards for every stage and run over the course of fire in my head over and over again. Before each stage, I would assess the wind and the density altitude and write down my elevation and windage for each shot, color-coded. I may not have the experience and the skill set that some of the regular PRS competitors had, but I was determined to make the most of the things that I did have control over. So I really worked hard on some of the smaller things that a lot of guys wouldn't have thought about. And it's funny how stress just ruins things for you. When I was kind of panicky in the previous 3 stages, when things started going wrong, I just couldn't access the subconscious part of my brain that had stored the information that I'd studied on those sheets when I'd run through the course of fire in my head over and over again. But the moment I started calming down, it's like all that stuff came back to me and I was able to move quickly through the positions I needed to and kind of get over that mental hurdle. And stage 7 ended up being a really good one. Tank trap, so more positional shooting off a bag, and Travis Ishida, the founder of the NRL, running the stage, which I thought was pretty cool. This was also the stage where I gave up trying to look respectable by wearing shoes, so Barefoot Matt took over, and what an improvement Barefoot Matt was. It's stages like this where the balance of the gun and a good solid sandbag plays such a big part. I could plonk the gun on the bag and it would just sit still. I've had a lot of people laugh at me also for using a muzzle brake on an air gun, but keep in mind that this gun is dumping a lot of air out that muzzle, significantly more actually than a 22 rimfire, which can operate at a much higher working pressure and therefore use less gas to achieve the same speed. Even a tiny amount of muzzle flip can affect the shot, and the brake just keeps the gun dead still. This is particularly important if you consider that this is an 800mm barrel, which means that it's about double the length of a 16-inch 22 long rifle barrel. So the slug essentially sits in the barrel for twice as long and therefore is affected more by muzzle flip and barrel movement. I ended up getting 8 out of 10 hits for the stage, which I was really happy with considering the conditions.
Hey, did somebody check to make sure he's not shooting 22?
With stages 6 to 10 wrapped up on the lower range, we made our way towards the upper range to start on stage 1 to 5. And the way that this course layout worked was that stages 6 to 10 were based on the monthly NRL 22 course of fire, which essentially meant that there were very specific targets that needed to be used. Distance was limited to 100 yards, and there wasn't a lot of out-of-the-box thinking because NRL 22 needs to make sure that the targets and distances are easily accessible to any club that wants to take part in that month's shoot. Stages 1 to 5 though were up to Utah Air Guns, and if you know anything about Utah Air Guns, they were going to make it fun. They went all out with fire trucks, ATVs, armored personnel carriers, and targets shaped like doves and ground squirrels and you name it, all the way out to 200 yards. So this was going to be interesting. The wind though was just ridiculous. This was a true gale force now, and while some people were groaning about this, I was grinning because 200 yards in this wind is where a 40 grain 22 cal slug would really shine. My squad would be starting at stage 3, where we'd be engaging dove-shaped targets out a saloon window, and this was right down my alley. Make me shoot paper and I'll be average at best, but put a dove or a squirrel or a monkey in front of me and I forget how to miss. The first shot here was just out of frame to the left. Nicole didn't quite know the course of fire as well as I did, but the rest were all on camera. In this stage, we had to change position a couple times and shoot through different gaps in the saloon. Once again, having a balanced gun and a good bag made all the difference here, especially shooting off the door, which was basically a sloping piece of plywood.
Impact. 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 Impact.
1 minute. I had the option here of shooting off a single bag or off a bipod and a rear bag, and ended up using the bipod, which I think was probably the right choice.
Impact. Impact.
30 seconds.
Anything on the barricade.
Impact. Impact. Good shot.
You got a target down, Alex.
Yep, I saw.
Nice, well done.
We'll have to go forward.
So I ended up clearing that stage, which I was obviously super happy about, especially considering all the positional changes, the distances and the wind. But I think what really kind of kept me calm and kept me focused was the fact that there was a sense of familiarity about the style of shooting. I mean, I've shot stuff out of windows before. Yeah, I mean, evaporating a monkey with a 300 WSM is a little bit different, but similar concept. I've also shot doves before under similar time pressure, moving between targets. So once again, that's what I love about this event. Even though I don't compete regularly or compete at all in PRS competitions, it's very similar to the real thing. Of course, the moment I shoot a good stage, all the cameras are all over me asking me questions, but I really just wanted to clear my head and focus on the next stage, which would be shooting prairie dogs out to 190 yards off an ATV. Once again, right down my alley. I've been shooting ground squirrels off vehicles for years, and I knew I was going to have fun.
Impact. Impact.
50 seconds. Make those shots count. Here we go, students. Push it. You ready?
Impact.
35.
Impact.
Impact.
Impact. Impact.
Time. Okay, that's fine. Okay, Lauren.
Impact. Impact.
I just took my time.
Miss. Impact.
Wow. 9 hits. You are without a doubt the highest count today.
And now for the next stage, the mystery stage, the one that none of us could prepare for. And of course, being Utah air guns, they couldn't settle for something mundane. They got a flippin' armored personnel carrier, and we'd be shooting from inside it and on top of it. So once again, it was going to be a lot of fun. This stage had targets out to 125 yards, so I kind of cobbled together a quick card and started off inside the vehicle, shooting through a small gap.
Impact. Impact.
True story, I actually got a pretty bad cramp in my calf right about now while sitting in a really awkward position, but I just tried to ignore it and kept on shooting. The first 2 targets were at 50, the next 2 at 86.
Impact. Impact.
And after engaging the 86-yard targets, I had to open the bolt and climb up a ladder with the rifle out of a small hole and set up on the roof for the last few shots at 110 yards and 125 yards.
Impact. Transition. Come out. Get in the bed. 2 shots. 1 shot apiece. Impact. 30 seconds. Impact. Impact.
I missed one at 110 and at 125, but I'll take an 8 out of 10, considering that the wind was pretty challenging.
Great shooting, Matt.
Thank you. Stage 1 was the fire truck stage, and I'd run through this course of fire so many times in my head, probably more than anything else, and I felt so prepared, but I made such a stupid error. You see, the way that I prepared for this was I kind of pre-made cards for each stage with the number of targets, the distances of the targets, the positions that I'd be shooting from, and I left columns open for elevation and windage data, which I was going to add later. I then also entered all the target information into Strelok Pro. There's a feature in Strelok Pro where you can add your course of fire, including the distances and everything, and basically in real time, before each stage began, with the density altitude accounted for, I would enter the wind conditions for that particular stage, and I would transfer the data from Strelok Pro onto my cards. The error I made when transferring this data across was that on Strelok Pro, I had the targets in order of distance, not in the order of what I was going to shoot them in, and on the card, I had them in a different order. So when I transferred this data across, I swapped around 2 of the distances. I made 147 yards, 0.2 mils, and 67 yards, 4 mils. Obviously very wrong. Thankfully, I picked up part of this error before the stage and corrected the 147 yard target, but I didn't notice the other one, and it would come back to haunt me. This was actually a relatively complex stage. We had to start in the driver's seat and collect the bag and magazine from a side compartment before climbing up to the rifle, and for some reason my safety was engaged. I never use my safety, so this confused me for a while and cost me quite a bit of time trying to figure out what was wrong, and of course this put me under quite a bit of pressure straight away. So I nailed all 4 shots on the 147 yard target, and I had to take them pretty fast to make up time, but I then had to move all the way around and climb up onto the roof, which took a bit of time, and this is where things start to go a little bit wrong again. The main camera didn't capture this 43-yard target, but I did hit, miss, and then hit again. I probably just missed it because of target movement, if I remember correctly. And then, flip. I look at my card and realize that 4 mils is definitely not the right number for the 67-yard target. Now, if I was just thinking clearly and not under pressure, I would have instantly known that 67 yards is basically my second zero. I didn't have to hold anything for the shot, but thinking straight is not something that you do when you're under pressure. And although by some luck I hit the steel the first time, I then miss it twice, probably just holding over too much. That was 20 points that I should have easily got. I was really bummed about this one, to be honest, because I knew it was avoidable, and needless to say, I triple checked my data before the next stage.
Start standing, gear in hand, magazine inserted, action open. Shooter must have the game changer bag provided on stage in hand.
That one, we use our own game changer.
Shooter must have the game changer bag provided on stage in hand.
Okay, would you read that one more time?
Yeah. On the start signal, the shooter will engage a 50-yard target with 2 shots from any position on the barricade. Shooters will change position on the barricade and engage a 100-yard target with 2 shots. You got it.
So now we were on the last stage, stage 2, which would feature the longest shot of the course at 200 yards, plus a few other green steel plates at 150, 150 yards. This one was open to a little bit of interpretation because the coursifier said we needed to change position 3 times on the barricade, but it didn't say which positions we needed to use. So we could kind of decide where we wanted to position ourselves. And I thought very, very clearly and carefully about where I wanted to be and for which particular targets. Because if I chose an easier position for an easier target and was left with a difficult position for one of the longer targets, I might lose points. So thought about it very carefully, and I think I made the right decision in the end. And to make things more interesting, the rain started coming down just as we started shooting the last stage. Unfortunately, the action camera died at this point, so we'd only have one angle, but I asked Nicole to film me rather than the targets for this one because I thought that the positional changes were probably the main feature of this stage. We started off at 50 yards, 2 shots at the same target, and I took my time here waiting for the target to stop moving before my second shot.
Hit back.
I then moved to a kneeling position to engage the 100-yard target twice, and some guys shot from a kneeling position again. I chose to lie prone and use a bag on the wood. I didn't want to risk having my bipod too low to clear the obstacle and waste time adjusting it. And I felt pretty good in this position with the bag, hitting the 150-yard plate both times.
Impact. Hit. Impact. Impact. Impact.
I then had to move to the rooftop, and that 200-yard plate was just big enough that I could rattle off both shots pretty quickly before moving back to the 150-yard plate.
Impact. Impact. Clean.
Well done.
Thank you.
RMAC.
Finishing strong.
I had a lot of them where I should have waited. My issue, not waiting for.
This is quite a cool clip that Nicole captured because this is myself, Boyd, and Justin, who would later all be on the podium together, just chatting about how we found the course. One thing we all agreed about is that those swinging targets sucked, but overall, a really awesome day. Well, how do I sum that up? We've had so many seasons in one day. We had gale force winds, probably 30 to 40 mile per hour winds just ripping through here early this morning. Then it just went dead for a while, and now the rain's coming down. So if ever there were extreme conditions to shoot a match in, this is it. I don't know what to feel about my performance. I feel like I held my own pretty well, and I had some stages where I got the best out of the gun, and I cleaned 3 stages, which I hear is quite good in these conditions, and got quite a few 9s as well. But I also bombed out a bit, and on 2 stages I think I scored 2s on 2 stages, which really killed me. I think if I could hold it together for those 2, I'd stand a very good chance. But at the end of the day, staying calm comes with experience, and as I shoot more of these competitions, that's something that I'll begin to settle down and not overthink things and not stress out. So yeah, I'm pretty happy. I'll try wipe those 2s from my memory and try to focus on the good stuff, but at the end of the day, my gun just shot fantastic, and yeah, next year I'll be back.
In third place, $5,000 with a score of 740, Justin Welch. Second place, with a score of 750, 10 more, very close, $10,000. Matt Dubber.
First place in the Precision Marksman Challenge Pro class for $20,000. $20,000. With a score of 800, Boyd Linder. If you guys remember from last year.
So yeah, second place out of all those shooters. That's pretty crazy. And if you told me that halfway through the course of fire, after all those terrible stages, I probably would have laughed at you, but somehow I managed to kind of claw my way back into contention. And yeah, to stand on a podium and to earn $10,000 was amazing, but I think the most rewarding thing was just knowing that without any practice in that event, I was able to hold my own against some of the best shooters out there, and even do better than a lot of experienced PRS shooters. Justin and Boyd are really, really good shooters, and I felt like I didn't deserve to be standing on a podium with them at all. I just feel like I'm not in the same class, but I really do feel that the gun that I was shooting and the slugs that I was shooting was kind of a bit of an equalizer, and it allowed me to not have to hold as much for the wind. And the most rewarding thing for me was knowing that I had worked on these slugs, on the design of these slugs with Patriot. I had worked on all 3 of the barrels that were on the podium. All those slug liners were something that I'd worked on. And the fact that myself and Justin were both using prototype element Theos scopes, basically the only 2 element Theos scopes in the whole PRS competition, and we both ended up on the podium, made me feel like, yes, I had contributed to this, like I'd done something right, and that for me is what I do this for. It's not about the podiums and all of that. I just love seeing some of the stuff that I've been working on actually work in the real world. And I must give credit to Boyd here, because as far as I know, he was using 25 grain 22 cal slugs, which probably have less than half the BC of my 40 grain slugs. And that just goes to show how good he was on that day. He would have had to hold a lot more than me for the wind. So credit to him, really, really good shooting by Boyd. And he 100% deserved to win that competition. I'm going to wrap this one up by answering a question that I get asked a lot, and I got asked a lot during this PRS competition. Why would I shoot a 40 grain slug at 1,040 feet per second if I had the opportunity with that gun and that power level to shoot, let's say, a 30 or 34 grain slug at like 1,100 feet per second? It comes down to something called a drag curve, and I'll try to condense this into as little time as possible. But essentially, as a projectile gets closer to that speed of sound, the drag actually becomes greater. And you don't see it if you look at just the ballistic coefficient, because a ballistic coefficient number is basically just telling you how close that projectile is to a specific drag curve. It's not actually telling you what the drag curve itself looks like. So if I have to take a G1 drag curve, which is what a lot of people use for just generic bullets or slugs, you'll see that G1 drag curve does climb from sort of Mach 0.8 towards Mach 1. It gets significantly higher. And what this means is that you will get more drag the faster you shoot. It's the same thing if you use an RA4 drag curve or a GA drag curve for pellets. They just look slightly different, but they all increase close to the speed of sound. When it comes to bullet drop, you can still gain an advantage by shooting extremely fast, because the bullet is still getting there quicker, therefore it drops a bit less. But wind works differently. Wind drift works totally differently. Wind drift is a function of something called lag time. And essentially what lag time is if you had to take the time of a bullet fired through a vacuum where there's no drag over, let's say, 200 yards, there'd be a specific time that it takes to get there, but there'd be no wind drift, correct? Because there's no drag. So even though there is a time delay between the shot and the impact on target, there's no wind drift. Lag time is the difference between that theoretical time to the target in zero drag compared to the actual time it takes to get there. That's your lag time. And wind drift is purely a function of lag time. The funny thing is that even though you might be shooting faster and the bullet is getting to the target quicker when you shoot faster, your lag time might actually be higher because your ballistic coefficient is lower. If I take my exact slug, 40 grain Javelin Gen 2, and I shoot it at 1100 feet per second, that slug will actually drift more in the wind if I shoot it at 1100 feet per second than it would have at 1040. It's pretty ridiculous, right? You can predict a bullet drop pretty consistently, but if you've got wind that you can't measure down range, you lose the ability to predict it, and that's where a higher ballistic coefficient comes into play. I would rather shoot a 40 grain slug slower than a 34 or 30 grain slug faster, because it doesn't actually give you an advantage. The same thing is actually true for pellets, and pellets reach this peak in the drag curve much earlier because of their shape. That is why I'm shooting my bench gun 30 cal pellet at like 850 feet per second, because if I go 900 and above, the wind drift becomes significantly worse. Test this. Go plug your put in a 5 mile per hour crosswind, plug your ballistic data into an app like Sherlock Pro, and put the speed up. Your wind drift will actually increase. So yes, there is a sweet spot, and yes, sometimes it's good to get more speed for the sake of having a better margin for error at distances if you get your distance wrong and you have to account for drop, but there's always a sweet spot and there's always a trade-off, and now you know. And last thing to mention is that you'll notice that the RA4 drag function can actually be shot faster before this drag curve starts to pick up, and that's why with air rifle slugs we're kind of aiming for that RA4 shape, which is more of a rounded nose and a bigger me-plat, because if you go a sharp pointy nose, which is more in the profile of a G1 projectile, you're not actually benefiting anything in any way. So that's something we consider when we design the Javelin slugs as well. It's why we put the RA4 BC on the container, not just the G1 BC. I have to talk about the big ball competition just a little bit, and this is such a contrast to the precision rifle, because we shot the big ball straight off the precision rifle, but while I was praying for a lot of wind during the precision rifle because I knew that my setup was ballistically superior to everything else, I was praying for calm conditions for the big ball because I knew my setup was inferior to everything else in terms of BC. The minimum energy requirement for the big ball is 140 foot-pounds of energy. I wish it wasn't, because then I would have just entered with a 22 cal and I would have probably done extremely well, because I know that gun so well and I know the BC is so high on those slugs and it's so accurate. And 300 yards is honestly a joke for that gun on targets this big, but 140 foot-pounds is the limit, and I entered with an FX Impact, which with all the power kit and everything could only barely reach that 140 foot-pound minimum power level. 17 mile per hour wind. I think I was at 143 foot-pounds with a 30 cal Javelin Gen 2 prototype slug, 64 grain. I considered using a 357 or 9mm slug, but in the end I decided 30 cal was the way to go because the ballistic coefficient was higher. The BC of those slugs is around 0.14 as well, pretty much the same as the 40 grain 22. But the guys we were shooting against had like 357s and 45s and 50 cals and 257s with double the ballistic coefficient. So yeah, we were at a bit of a disadvantage, but we knew the guns were also accurate. I was really tired after the PRS, so I didn't really want to sign up for the big bore. However, I wanted to use it as an opportunity to test the prototype 30 caliber Javelin Gen 2 slugs, which are now in production. So I entered anyway, and I was such an idiot. I didn't take time to zero the gun beforehand properly. So I arrived, I was trying to understand the course of fire, and when I started shooting at these big targets, much bigger than I thought they'd be, I kept missing and my zero was way off, and it took me I think 6 shots before I called in Andries from Patriot, and I said, Andries, please spot for me and tell me where I'm missing.
You were center, you're much above it.
Okay, I'm probably about 8 MA off then, way off. So to the left of the land, right?
Yes. I'm doing your job.
So the wind actually didn't do anything. Andries gave me the correction, I zeroed the gun, and from the point that I zeroed the gun, I did not miss a single shot, all the way out to basically 290 yards.
Okay, so center, dead center.
So my scope was just a bit off earlier, but...
Second one was dead center. Cool.
Impact.
Oh!
2 right on top of each other,
Yeah.
see that?
One 4 o'clock off the bolt,
Yeah.
one 7 o'clock off the bolt. Just so far.
Exactly.
So far off the bolt. Okay, we got it.
That for me was really frustrating because I realized that I could have actually done really well and possibly even been on the podium if I just flippin' zeroed my gun. So lesson learned for next year. Those impacts may not have the same ballistic coefficient as some of the proper big bores, but they are accurate enough that if you plug in the right ballistic data, you can potentially clean that whole course. Those targets are pretty big, and even in that strong wind, we were doing really well.
Impact. That's it.
Impact.
Impact. So you can hear it.
Well, my first big ball competition, and I so wish I checked my zero beforehand because once I figured it out, it was shooting really, really well. I think my last 7 or 8 shots were all hits, which at these distances in this wind, I'm super happy with. And this is just a stock standard impact with an 800mm slug barrel, a tungsten hammer, and 64 grain Javelin Gen 2 slugs, which will be available very, very soon. These are in full production now. We just have to get our production numbers up and get the packaging printed and all of that so we can get them out. But these are shooting super well and very, very happy. But it's been a very long day. And I just want to take a bit of a rest now, but we've got some fun stuff coming up later as well.
Number 2 as you finish up.
I also ended up spotting for Chris Turek, who was shooting in a different relay to me, and Chris was also using a 64 grain Javelin Gen 2 30 cal slug at pretty much the same speed, so we were able to kind of learn off each other and use the same BC and everything. Chris also didn't zero properly before the competition, but once again, once Chris had zeroed properly, I was giving him accurate wind calls, and he was slamming that target at like also close to 300 yards, and both of us were kind of punching ourselves afterwards for not doing the proper preparation because we could have done much better.
And we're going with the 64 grain brand new prototype Javelins, and I'll tell you what, when we were out in the desert, we were ringing steel and holding just edge of the freaking target every single time at 300 yards. Matt was calling some wind shots for me today, kind of dropped a couple of shots, but thanks Matt for helping me out. We finished strong. I think we hit the last 6 targets, so thanks a lot.
The most rewarding thing for me was when I started shooting and missing everything, I saw some of the guys sort of laughing at me that I was coming there with this little FX impact that wasn't built for big bore, and how dare I think I could show up to their event and actually do well. But towards the end, once I'd zeroed it, that gun was so predictable, and when I started hitting everything, and the guys next to me started missing stuff, yeah, it was rewarding just knowing that, again, the work that I'd put into barrels and slugs and towards making these guns suitable for long range shooting with slugs had paid off, and we were starting to meet the same level of big bore performance as the other guys. Next year we'll be serious contenders, I can promise you that. Once again, I really appreciate that you guys would hang around through all my babbling. I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you learned something, and I really hope to see you there next year at Rocky Mountain Airgun Challenge. Maybe you'll even use some of the things that I've learned and I've shared with you today and come next year and beat me. I would love to be able to shoot against you guys. It's so much fun and it's worth signing up. So thanks for watching. See you next time.